global order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm joined by Akhil Ramesh today. Akhil heads the India uh, part of the work of the Pacific Forum based out of Hawaii. He's the director of the India Center, and he's had very interesting comments about American politics, Indian politics, how the twain sometimes meet, sometimes don't meet. And it's a particularly interesting juncture to talk to Akhil as Donald Trump has won his second big victory, in a sense, a historic landmark victory in the US presidential elections. What does that mean for America? What does that mean for India? What does that mean for the Indo-Pacific? I would love to discuss all of this with Akhil Ramesh, and that's why I invited him to have a conversation with me. Akhil, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Hindol. Good to be here.
Let me begin by talking about Trump's second victory, which was historic by any counts. A lot of people have said a lot of things about how this will change the landscape. As far as you are concerned, let me begin by asking you, how do you see America's great pivot to the Indo-Pacific changing because of this? Does that change at all? Because at least in the last few years, America has been very preoccupied by the war in Ukraine and, of course, the war in Gaza. Do you see some of that change? Will Trump actually be able to conclude one of the conflicts there and the pivot strongly returning to the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, I think there are two interesting developments. One is that President Trump ran on a peace ticket. He promised peace. Unlike other candidates running for office over the last 2 decades, he's known as a candidate who runs on realism and restraint. He prefers realist foreign policy and restraint, as opposed to neoliberalism and neoconservatism that have dominated Washington, D.C. Discourse. The second thing is nominations for Secretary of State and NSA. News just broke that he has nominated Michael Waltz from Florida and Marco Rubio again from Florida to be the NSA and Secretary of State, respectively. Both of them are great picks, particularly if you're looking for someone to be harsh or hawkish on China. Since China is a catalyst for cooperation in the US-India bilateral, I think these developments help the US-India relationship and thus the US Indo-Pacific strategy.
So you're saying, in a sense, the focus returns to China in many ways,
Yes.
which in a sense has lagged over the last few years because of the two wars I mentioned. What kind of steps do you think will be taken? Do you think there'll be more trade related steps, more tightening of the belt there as far as trade is concerned, a focus on the tariffs and levies? Do you think also very critically, the sourcing of many in, critical things like critical minerals, issues like that, electronics, ICT related issues? Do you think all of that will come onto the table once again with high focus?
Yes, definitely. The last 4 years, well, there was a focus on China in the context of export controls and trade restrictions. I think Middle East and Eastern Europe, stole the attention. Ukraine and what's happening in Gaza have been the central focus in Washington, and the Indo-Pacific had been pushed to the back burner. One good thing from the Trump administration will be getting back to the drawing board on the Indo-Pacific, finding novel ways to, competing with China and addressing the China challenge, quote unquote. That would entail looking at trade, because one thing with the Trump administration is its focus has always been on using economic statecraft as a weapon instead of conventional security weapons. So that would imply the use of sanctions or tariffs, and once again back to trade wars. So I think the U.S.-China competition will heat up, particularly in the critical and advanced technology space, and in the form of restrictions and tariffs.
Well, many would ask at this juncture that there is an Achilles heel to all of this, isn't it? And that Achilles heel, of course, is that America has $35 trillion in public debt. And a lot of that, in a sense, is held in terms of the greenbacks that China buys and continues to buy, which is why America can continue to print. Now, this sort of symbiotic relationship, which has survived even with all the conflict, all the sort of rhetoric, has been one of the backbones which has allowed America to build up this kind of debt and keep, keep the economy running, so to speak. Now, this Achilles heel, it's unclear to many how this would be addressed. In your opinion, what do you think could be the next steps on this?
So it goes both ways. The debt is a case of interdependence. It is not a dependence, but an interdependence. China holds U.S. Debt, so does Saudi Arabia, so does Japan, and many others. Partners, allies, and rivals hold U.S. debt. But there is only one way, because China letting go of the debt will have an impact on its own economy as well. China cannot act on the debt per se. But the interdependence is not just in the monetary assets. As you know, that the US has counted on China to manufacture everything from pin to a ship. And anything you find at a Walmart here in the US is made in China. This level of dependence will not be addressed, but I think any administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, even in a Trump administration, will work toward de-risking and not decoupling. Because as we see it, even a Trump who wants to use economic statecraft would not want inflation levels to be in double digits, because starting a trade war, especially in goods that could affect the average Joe, is not something Trump would want to pursue.
I like the choice of words that you used, Akhil, of de-risking rather than decoupling. Now, of course, decoupling, as both you and I understand, is number one, not easy to do. B, it would take a lot of time. Where would those kind of manufacturing, capabilities be found in the world? Can America build those capabilities? But and then even if it tries to build those capabilities, what is the time period in which those capabilities would have to be built? All of these questions are not easy questions to answer. But let's zero in on the point of de-risking. Now, one of the ways that this de-risking could happen, of course, has been in sort of the birth of terminologies after COVID, like friendshoring, like supply chain resilience, and so on and so forth, which is also one of the reasons why countries like India or Vietnam have come into focus. Do you see that effort growing further to make the supply chains even more resilient, to move some of the capital which was headed towards China to other countries like a Vietnam or in India, and develop deeper, manufacturing capabilities there, including export capabilities, also R&D capabilities? I, of course, allude to the growing number of GCCs in a country like India, where a lot of global innovation is happening. How do you see this?
I think in the Trump administration, I think it is going to slow down a bit. I might be, taking on the administration too early, but because the Biden administration was open to moving jobs, was open to offshoring, because friendshoring, end of the day, is another form of offshoring. The Trump administration will be highly protectionist, including protecting its jobs. That even moving to an ally would be seen as moving away from its core ideology of onshoring. So that challenge will be one of the challenges to be, I suppose, meted out early on with the US and its partners. Secondly, Trump has consistently called certain countries as abusers of the international trading system, including Vietnam, including India. So these are the countries, while partners of the US, are also termed as abusers of the trading system. Trump would have an issue simply with the trade imbalance. With the software exports that India, exports, but when it comes to imports, it does not allow as much, say, agricultural goods from the US. So similarly in Southeast Asia, I think Trump has had issues with those goods finding a space in the US, but American goods not finding space in Southeast Asia compared to other goods. So I think there will be a mercantilist approach, transactional mercantilist approach to trade, which could be setting the concepts such as friendshoring, nearshoring, and other concepts that came about, right after COVID-19, or rather as a result of COVID-19.
Let's also talk about, the other option, which is to try and develop some capacity at home. How do you see that progress? Because, this has been tried in bits and spurts before, but this is extremely difficult to do simply because, the kind of labor you need, the kind of labor at the cost that you need, all of this is hard to procure. Also, many sort of industrial towns, once they deindustrialize, to reindustrialize them is a very, very hard thing to do because a lot of the skill sets have gone. How do you see that progressing within America?
So, President Trump and his President-elect Trump in his first term in office tried to do the same, very same. He tried to revive manufacturing places that had lost. So Biden, interestingly, through industrial policies, either through the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, had several targeted subsidies to do precisely the same, revive manufacturing. He succeeded. Interestingly, he succeeded in many red states and paradoxically in red states in reviving manufacturing. It is possible, but not to the extent of the 1970s or 1980s America, where every good that you found in the supermarket was made in USA. You won't have T-shirts or shirts made in USA anymore, but you could have an EV battery or a chip made in the USA.
That's where people like Elon Musk come in, because one of the promises of the new Trump administration, upcoming Trump administration, in a sense, powered by, may I say, by people like Donald Trump and even by people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and many others of that genre, is to essentially reframe and retake the advantage, the R&D advantage that seems to be slipping away to countries like China, back very firmly to US shores. So a lot of impetus seems to be on this, on, in a sense, keeping alive the American hegemony as far as R&D and innovation is concerned. What are the roadblocks to this? And, can this be achieved? Because, it's not enough only for Elon Musk to do it, but obviously this has to be a far broader, context for this to succeed.
See, to be honest, China has done exceptionally well, particularly in the critical advanced technology space. They've
Look at
invested
China
in
and EVs, for instance. Even though
exactly,
Tesla was such a pioneer, today China
yeah,
is the leader in EVs.
exactly. Tesla, maybe I think it was 14 years ago, 15 years ago, in an interview with Bloomberg, I think Musk was laughing to a question on Chinese EVs. Today, now the Chinese have the last laugh. It's the BYDs and CATLs that have cornered the market in the battery space and in the EV space as well. So Musk is trailing, Tesla is trailing in China. So I think ignorance and arrogance, it's a deadly combination. And some entrepreneurs or some auto entrepreneurs, especially in the US, are known to be that way. Starting from Henry Ford to the CEOs after who made fun of Tata to most recently Tesla. I think if they get too arrogant, there's always competition coming from the East. The Chevrolets, the Fords learned from the East, Japan, and Tesla is learning from the BYDs of the world, and such arrogance could cost them. So I believe to stay ahead, they have to spend a lot more money and resources on R&D and also on targeted supply chain initiatives. But the question is, does Trump's electorate in Middle America, in states that basically put him to the White House, like Michigan, like Ohio, Indiana, Arizona, will his electorate, the people who voted for him, will they be okay if he moves jobs to friendly shores? That is a big question. That is to be seen.
Other question a lot of people are asking, especially in Europe, Akhil, is that, it's all very well to say that, Europe doesn't pay enough for its security, it's dependent on America. But in a sense, there is a hidden symbiotic relationship, isn't there? In, America's famed military industrial complex, so to speak, runs on in a sense, on the basis of these promises of and security guarantees, because, a lot of the weapons purchased, a lot of the, shields provided, should I say, it's all American because America has a cutting edge, a definitive cutting edge. and provides this security guarantee, which is in a sense purchased by many of these countries, which is why they don't spend, or they don't have the, the right impetus to spend enough on defense. Now, if this begins to shred in a sense,
Mhm.
and that would, many would argue, that is also in a sense the shredding of NATO. If this begins to shred under Trump 2.0, a lot of things will come into play, including in Europe. Do you think the Trump administration is looking for that sort of end game?
Well, I would say it's pre and post. Pre-nominating Rubio and Michael Waltz. So I would have said yes. NATO, there's a serious risk of NATO being disbanded, and the Ukraine should be worried. But with Rubio's nomination, I believe there is some old school conservatism infused into the administration. They won't be as restrained, or they would not be following the foreign policy of restraint as much as, say, someone from the new populist movement taking up the role of Secretary of State. I think that's one good thing coming out of Rubio being the Secretary of State. Granted, it's not finalized, but if he ends up being the Secretary of State, I think places like Ukraine, Taiwan, would not have to be as worried as, say, a populist taking that role. Because many were concerned that Trump 2.0 could have members that would be very antagonistic to any regime that is dependent on U.S. resources. Think of Ukraine. It relies on U.S. military support. But that said, I think transatlantic relations will continue to be tense. When I say continue to be, the extension from the Trump 1.0 to 2.0. I think in the second administration, it'll be tense as well, because Trump would want them to pay their fair share. Would that be a 3% of their GDP, or maybe buying more American goods? Like I said earlier, it's going to be a transactional and mercantilist approach. So what kind of a deal, as Trump would like to say, he comes up with will determine the course of the relationship.
And it's not just the transatlantic relationships, Akhil, as far as America and Europe is concerned. And in that, I would also, put in the sort of interesting relationship and dynamic that the US today shares with the UK, but also countries like Japan and South Korea, which increasingly have made noises in the recent past that their own security is more challenged today than ever before. I mean, Japan is militarizing in a certain way. South Korea is making interesting noises. The Saudis have very openly said that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would be forced to get nuclear weapons too. There is a whole dynamic evolving there. And all of this used to be stable because of the kind of protection or guarantees that America provided. How do you see this playing out?
Well, yes and no. To your last point on they were stable because America provided the security, I would disagree there. Countries such as Saudi Arabia have always been independent and autonomous. I mean, we saw that with the Biden administration. If you crack the whip, I think the Saudis are not, afraid of, hitting back. They have options. I think they made it clear. They are one of those strategically autonomous powers like India, the UAE, and others. So I think the Saudis are a little different. I think with the Saudis, Trump would continue his style of taking a slide or a presentation and then offering these for sale. So that could be his approach once again. But with East Asia, it's a little different because East Asia traditionally has had American military presence as a balancing act. And this has also made East Asia, particularly countries like Japan, a bit, slow to spend on their defense. But South Korea is a different case, of course. I think the Koreans are prepared. They've, their system and their practice with regards to conventional warfare is different. Japan has turned into a more pacifist power over the last 70 years. So in that case, I think Shinzo Abe and Trump relations were one of the, the bromance was behind the good relations between the two. If the new leader in Japan can pull off a similar bromance, I think there might be, opportunities for increased collaboration between Japan and the U.S. And from what I understand, the new Japanese leader was someone who proposed an Asian NATO. So the Asian NATO idea, I don't know if it will be revived or if Trump has interest in it, because if he's not interested in a European NATO, a new Asian NATO he may not have the appetite for it. That said, if the Asian NATO has a different model, unlike the European NATO, where hardly anyone spends 3% of GDP, besides probably Eastern European countries like Poland. If they have 4 countries or 5 countries, now I'm thinking of the Quad and other groupings, if they have these countries spending enough, and if they are purchasing American weapons, I think Trump would find that to be an incentive.
Let's talk a little bit about India then, because that's another part of the puzzle. India's had a very interesting relationship. We always hear that there is a sort of broad consensus across party lines on India in DC, on the Beltway, so to speak, right? And yet, in the last couple of years, especially with the troubles that began in Canada on the Khalistan issue, this relationship has had a fairly bumpy road. And that bumpy road, in a sense, continues. Many people thought that this was going to get even bumpier if Kamala Harris comes to power, because of of the kind of influences she has within the Democratic Party. Those people are convinced that Trump will be different, that his approach would be different, and he would be far less concerned about India's actions to tackle Khalistani separatism than say the Democrats were. And he would also see the Khalistanis as a genuine danger to peace within the United States and within North America, which perhaps the Democrats did not quite see in exactly that light. How do you see this relationship proceed from here on? Because once again, you just mentioned bromance, and I was reminded of Howdy Modi. Here is Trump and Modi back again, and could there, as they say in Hindi, could their jugalbandi, as it were, their twin dance, as it were, continue?
Um, yes and no. So see, it's not a running a country is not a one-man thing. Romance, yes. Trump and Modi, yes. But whether it's New Delhi or Washington, there are more departments, there are more bureaucracies, there are more entrenched practices and cultures and people who've been there for the last 30, 40 years who have been dedicated their seats. So with that said, I think there's at the leadership level, I think there'll be definitely an interest to reset the relationship to the in a positive upward trajectory, which the Biden administration lost in the last few years. I think they were very distracted by many things, many conflicts around the world, and they let certain non-state actors hijack the relationship. I think Trump would not be so short-sighted, but we never know. Washington has its own ways, and the establishment will find different ways to, always pull down the relationship. Like I always said, the relationship at track 1 level, government to government, is a success. But at the track 2, it's always been a challenge, whether it is the think tankers or the media or the policy wonks in DC or in New Delhi. I think they still, from the Cold War era, I think the idea of the US and the idea of India is still, thought of as not, these.
As we come to the last part of our conversation, Akhil, I have one or two last questions for you. One of the questions, of course, is how do you see, Trump has come with this promise, this 3-minute speech, which has got viral. Trump has come with this promise to really change the inner workings of government in America. Some of the things that Vivek Ramaswamy used to talk about on the campaign trail, change the face of bureaucracy, change many of the old ways of doing things. How much of that do you think is really possible?
Well, in domestic policies, yes. In foreign policy, a lot more difficult, simply because of the variables. There are a lot more things one can control in domestic politics versus in foreign policy. And there are more pressing issues for the Trump administration that would directly impact his chances in the next term for the Republican government, and also strengthen his base. And there are other topics that he may not exactly fix. Case in point is immigration. He might work on building the wall, but he also promised, particularly to the many Indians were glad that he talked about the visa reform and things like that. But he has very little incentive to go through with those promises, because end of the day they don't vote. It's a very small diaspora, and he has very little to gain. So I think he'll focus mostly on things that he can win. I think it's basically things to strengthen his base. There are many issues that he could get into, but I think he has done a lot in the first term itself, whether it's the Supreme Court nominations to making reforms with regards to abortion rights to whatnot. I think this term will focus a lot more on correcting the first administration's mistakes, whether it's hiring the right people or getting things done, like not a half-built wall, but a full wall.
Sikal, talk a little bit about the point that you just alluded to, Akhil, which is that even though the American Indian diaspora is one of the most well integrated, well educated, wealthy, it does not have political heft. Now, some people believe that is changing. I want to understand from you, how do you see this entire universe, changing? Do you think more and more political activism is coming into the diaspora? Also, some people, including in Europe, consistently keep telling me that as more and more Indians get to the highest echelons of big, multinational companies in Europe and America, there is also a growing feeling it's almost an elite version of my job was Bangalore, if you know what I mean. That that here is this community which is really really successful at this, and in a sense, many of the top roles are going to them. Is that becoming a bit of a volatile mix in America too? How do you see this?
There's this old saying, it is lonely at the top. I think if you're a minority that is highly successful in a country, it becomes lonely. And especially if you're a community that does not want to get into good trouble, that is politics. The Indian diaspora in most places has refrained from getting into the dirty business, has refrained from getting into the swamps and fighting people out. I think the Indian diaspora, by and large, particularly in the US, has been doctors, engineers, and businessmen from the 1960s who migrated here to set up hotels to other businesses. So this mix does not help India. I think the politically active diaspora also leans one way. If you look at the Congress, or generally the mix of people who are politically active here among the Indian diaspora, it's always a Democrat. Even the ones who have won recently are all many are Democrats, most if not. So I think leaning one way, I think, is first challenge, and the second challenge is Indians aren't political enough. I think the Indian diaspora here sticks to their job and refrains from getting involved in these issues, unlike other diasporas.
But is that changing, Akhil? Is that beginning to, are there signs that it might be changing?
A little bit, yes and no. For example, there's the Hindu American Foundation that does great work, but they are a minority. Diaspora, by and large, refrains from getting involved in these policy issues. I think once they realize that standing on the sidelines is no longer an option, I think they'll get more involved. But I think still we have a long way to go. But if you're asking me if it has changed or if they're punching about their weight class, yes, 1% of the population, but we have so many people to advocate for us in DC. Yes, but still we could do a lot more.
Ramesh, we'll have to leave it at that. Thanks very much for going into a lot of detail about the post-Trump 2.0 scenarios. We'll, of course, have a lot of opportunity, I'm sure, in the future as Trump takes over the Oval Office to try and understand where he goes from there and what would happen in the next 4 years. I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.